Hello, and thank you for joining me for today's edition of Daf Yomi. Bava Metzia, Daf 96 on the day. Let's dive straight in. Rava Savala Kurabi Yonatan. By contrast, Rava holds in the contrary opinion of Rabbi Yonatan, and he explains the verse in the contrary opinion of Rabbi Yonatan, thereby arriving at the conclusion of the Braita. As is taught in the Braita, the Sanya, as is taught in the Braita, Rashi and others note that the text of Gemara which reads as is taught in the Braita is evidently a corrupted one, as the Gemara presents Rava's analysis of the verses and does not present a Braita. If his owner is with him, he does not pay. Teaches about a case in which the owner was working for the borrower at both points in time, and also teaches about a case in which he was working for him at one of those times, but not at the other one. In both cases, the borrower is exempt. The Gemara raises an objection, but it is also taught, if his owner is not with him, he shall pay. The verse teaches about the case in which the owner was not working for the borrower at either point in time, and it also teaches about a case in which he was working for him at one of those times, but not at the other one. In both cases, the borrower is liable. To reconcile the verses, one must say that the phrase, if his owner is with him, serves to tell you that if the owner was with the borrower, i.e. working for him, at the time of borrowing, then he does not need to be with him at the time when the animal is injured or dies for the exempt from liability to apply. But if he was with him at the time when the animal is injured or dies, he does not have to be with him at the time of the borrowing for the exemption to apply. The Gemara is a difficulty. I could reverse the conclusion and say that the borrower's exemption from liability is dependent upon the time when the animal was injured or died. The Gemara explains it is reasonable that the exemption from liability should be dependent on the time of the borrowing, because the borrowing is of greater significance, as with it the borrower brings his animal into his domain. The Gemara retorts, on the contrary, the time when the animal is injured or dies is of greater significance, because at that point marks when the borrower is actually liable to pay for any accidents that occurred. The Gemara responds, no, the borrowing is more significant. Were it not for the initial borrowing, what liability could be caused by the fact the animal is injured or died? The Gemara argues, but by the same logic, were it not for the fact that the animal is injured or died, what liability could be caused by the act of borrowing? The Gemara concludes, even still, the borrowing is of greater significance, as with it, the borrower is obligated to provide the animal sustenance as long as it's entrusted with him. So what's the footnote? Chayev bimso noseha. It is possible to find cases where the borrower does not need to provide sustenance for the deposit, e.g. a vessel, or an animal standing in a marsh with ample supplies of food available to it. Nevertheless, when there is a need to provide sustenance, the obligation to do so begins from the moment he borrows it, which indicates that it is also from that moment that his liability for mishaps begins. One who borrows an animal bears the responsibility to provide its sustenance from the moment he takes possession of it until the end of the borrowing period, and that's Navam Seif Mishpatim Hilchot Sheila Ufukadon 1:4 Shulchan Aruch Mishpatim 4:4. Ravasi said that the halacha that the borrower is exempt from liability is dependent upon the time of the borrowing can be derived from the verse itself. The verse states, and when a man borrows from another, he shall pay in Exodus 22:13. The precise formulation of the verse indicates that he borrowed an item from another, but that other person is not with him, i.e. working for him at the time. It is only in such a case that the verse concludes he shall pay. By inference, when the other person is working with him, the borrower is exempt. Accordingly, it is clear that the critical moment is the time of the borrowing. The Gemara asks, if so, why do I need the continuation of that verse? Its owner is not with him. And the next verse, if its owner is with him. According to Ravasi, the circumstance of the borrower's liability and exemption can be derived from the beginning of the first verse. The Gemara explains, if it were not for these additional clauses, I would say that the phrase from another is simply in the unusual manner of the verse and is not expounded to teach an exemption. Since the continuation of the verse and the next verse teach the actual exemption from liability, the apparent contradiction between them raises the question of when the critical moment is. It is apparent that the beginning of the verse was written in order to be expounded, as Ravasi said. Rami Bahama raises a dilemma. There is a dispute among the commentators about the topic of Rami bar Hama's inquiries. The Rambam and others explain that his questions continue the previous discussion concerning exemption from liability when one borrows an item together with the services of its owner. Rami bar Hama questions whether the exemption applies in the additional cases. Rashi explains that his question concerns the basic level of borrower's liability for mishaps and whether he is liable in all cases of borrowing. Rashi's opinion is more readily understood. Rami bar Hama is asking whether a borrower is liable due to the benefit he receives from the borrowed item, a factor that exists even in unusual cases of borrowing, or whether the liability is based on the assumed agreement between the parties, which might be limited to typical cases of borrowing. It appears that the Rambam took as a given that a borrower is liable due to the benefit received from the item. The fourth, Rami bar Hama can be discussing only application of exemption from liability and is asking which types of borrowing it applies to. See the Ma'ani HaChochma and the Minchas HaBoker. If one borrowed an animal and altercated in bestiality with it, a severe transgression, see Leviticus 18:23, what is halacha? Is a borrower liable for mishaps? The crux of the dilemma is, in order for him to be liable, do we require that the borrowing be a purpose similar to that which people typically borrow animals? And since people do not typically borrow animals for this purpose, the borrower is exempt. Or perhaps what is the reason that the borrower is liable is due to the benefit he derives from the animal, and as this borrower too has benefit from the animal, he is liable for mishaps. A similar question: if one borrowed an item, not to use it but to be seen with it, so that people will assume that he is wealthy, what is halacha? In order for him to be liable, do we require that he borrow an item of monetary worth, and that exists in that case? Or perhaps we require that he borrow an animal of monetary worth from which he also derives tangible benefit, and that does not exist in this case. Another question: if one borrowed an item to perform work with it that is worth less than the value of one putta. A putta was a copper coin that was the smallest unity of currency. For halachic purposes, the putta is defined as the value of pure silver, that is the weight of a barley grain. Traditionally, this is about 24 mg. Is that milligrams? Milligrams of silver. The halachic view of all coins is linked to the price of silver. What is halacha? Do we require that he borrow an item of monetary worth that exists in this case? Or perhaps any benefit derived that is worth less than one put is nothing? i.e., it is legally considered to be of no monetary worth and is therefore exempt? Another question: if one borrowed a cow in order to engage in bestiality with it, or present himself as wealthy, or to perform work of less than the value of one putta, or if he borrowed 2 cows to use them to perform work totaling the worth of one putta, the halacha in these cases is uncertain, as these dilemmas are left unresolved by the Gemara. Accordingly, if there is a mishap, the owner cannot claim the item via the shach. Many commentators understand that the Shulchan Aruch, in accordance with Rashi's opinion, applies these cases both to the issue of unavoidable accidents and to the exemption of borrowing an item together with its owner. Rambam Seif Mishpat She'inu for Kadon 2:9 Shulchan Aruch Mishpat 46:10 and the Smar there. To perform work with them that will be worth the value of one putta in total was halacha. When appraising the value of the benefit derived to see if it has a monetary worth of one putta, do we say follow the borrower and lender? I appraise how much benefit the borrower received from the lender, and in this case there is a benefit of the value of one putta. Or perhaps we follow the cows, and in this case each one of the cows does not provide the borrower with the monetary worth of one putta. Or perhaps we follow the cows, and in this case each one of the cows does not provide the borrower with the monetary worth of one putta. Another question: if one borrowed an item from 2 partners, and the services of one of those partners were also borrowed by him, what is halacha? Does the exemption of borrowing an item together with its owner apply in this case? For the exemption to apply, do we require all of the items owners to be working for the borrower, and that it does not exist in this case? Or perhaps there is no such condition, but in any event the borrower should at least be exempt from liability for that half of the item owned by the partner who was working for him. Another question is: in the case of partners who borrowed, shutafin sha'alu v'chulu, if one borrowed an item from two partners and also borrowed the services of one of them. And similarly, if partners borrowed an item and one of the partners also borrowed the services of the owner of the item, it's uncertain whether the exemption of borrowing an item together with its owner applies. Accordingly, if a mishap occurs, the owner cannot claim the item's value. If the owner seizes value from the borrower, the court does not repossess the sum from him. In the case of negligence, some authorities rule that the borrower is liable, while others, including the sheikh, hold that he is exempt from liability. And that's in the Bava Metzia Daf 2:8 or Mishpat in 46:11. His owner's services were also borrowed by one of them. What is halacha? For the exemption applied, do we require that the owner be working for all the borrowers? And that does not exist in this case. Or perhaps there is no such condition, but in any event, the borrower who borrowed only the item should at least be exempt from liability for half of the animal that the partner who the owner worked for had borrowed. Another question: if one borrowed an item from a woman, Shah Meyaha Isha, the commentary attributed to the Ritva explains that the sequence of the dilemmas. The Gemara begins by analyzing the problem of benefit that is less than one putta. Then, based on the assumption that there is a need for benefit of one putta, it addresses a case of one putta shared by two partners. Then the Gemara considers a case of a wife and husband who have a status similar to that of partners, and the services of a husband were also borrowed by him. If one borrowed a cow from a woman's usufruct property and also borrowed the services of a husband, or if a woman borrowed a cow for the requirements of her usufruct property and her husband borrowed the services of the owner of the cow, the exemption of borrowing an item together with its owner does not apply. This is because owning the right to use an item is not tantamount to ownership of the item itself. And that's the Rambam Sefer Mishpatim, 46:9. Or where a woman borrowed an item and its owner's services were also borrowed by her husband, was halacha. A husband has a right to use his wife's property. These questions are dependent on whether ownership of the right to use an item and the property it engenders tantamount to ownership of the item itself or not. The question here is whether the full right to use and derive benefit from the item is enough to define the owner of those rights as the owner of the item, while exclusive rights to an item suggest ownership. This person does not only title to the property, which might prevent him from being considered its owner. Ravina said to Ravasi, in the case of one who says to his agent, go and lend your services to somebody on my behalf, together with lending my cow to that person, what is halacha? For the exemption to apply, do I require the cow's actual owner work for the borrower? And in this case, does that not exist? Or perhaps since the legal status of a person's agent like that of himself, it's sufficient if his owner works for the borrower, and accordingly the necessary conditions exist. Rav Aha, son of Rav Avia, said to Ravasi, this question concerning a husband is subject to a dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish, and the question concerning an agent is subject to a dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yoshia. The Gemara clarifies, the question concerning a husband is subject to a dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish pertaining to the requirement to bring first fruits of one's field to the temple, and recite the accompanying declaration in Deuteronomy chapter 26. As it was stated, with regard to one who sells his field to another, not outright but for its produce, Rabbi Yochanan says, the buyer brings the fruits and recites, the first fruits of the new harvest were given to the priests, Deuteronomy 26, 1-11. During the temple period, the farmer will select the first fruits of the 7 types of produce with which Eretz Yisrael is especially favored: wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates, Deuteronomy 8:8. The sages instituted an ordinance that at least 1/60 of the harvest is brought as first fruits. The farmers would bring these fruits to the temple in a basket, place them before the altar, and recite the declaration expressing appreciation to God. See Deuteronomy 26:3-10. After the first fruits were given to the priest, who partook of them in the same condition in which they partook of teruma. The first fruits were brought to the temple between the festivals of Shavuot and Sukkot, and if they were not bought within this period, they could be bought into Hanukkah. Track they become in the Mishnah and the Rishon Talmud are devoted to the halacha and provisions governing this mitzvah. Besides the declaration, whereas Reish Lakish says the buyer brings the first fruits, but does not recite the declaration. One who purchases the right to the produce of the field is required to bring the first fruits of that field to the temple, but does not recite the accompanying declaration. This is because the owning the right of the produce of land is not tantamount to ownership of the land itself. The halacha is decided in accordance with the opinion of Reish Lakish, and the Gemara elsewhere rules in accordance with his opinion. That's Rambam Sefer Zeraim, Rechukum 4:6. The Gemara explains they disagree about whether it is justifiable for the buyer to recite the declaration, since in that declaration he refers to land as the land in which you, the Lord, has given me, in Deuteronomy 26:10, i.e. he states that the land belongs to him. Rabbi Yochanan says that the buyer brings the first fruits and recites the declaration because he holds that the ownership of the right to use land and its produce is tantamount to the ownership of the land itself. Accordingly, the buyer is considered to be the owner of the land, and he may consequently recite the declaration. Reish Lakish says that the buyer brings the first fruits but does not recite the declaration because he holds the ownership of right to use land and its produce is not tantamount to ownership of the land itself. And accordingly, the buyer is not considered to be the owner of the land and is consequently unable to recite the declaration. The Gemara clarifies the second disagreement. The question concerning an agent is subject to a dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yoshia, as is taught in the Brayta. If there is one who says to a steward appointed to take care of his household, all vows that my wife will vow from now until I come back from such and such a place, you shall nullify them for her in my stead, and the steward annulled them for her, one might have thought that they would be nullified. To dispel this notion, the verse states with regard to a vow taken by a wife, her husband sustains it and her husband nullifies it in Numbers 30:14, which indicates that only her husband is able to do so and no one else, in the statement of Rabbi Hoshea. Rabbi Yochanan says we have found elsewhere in halacha that the legal status of a person's agent is like that of himself. Since the steward was the agent of the husband, his nullification of vows is effective. A husband can neither sustain nor nullify his wife's vow to an agent. This ruling is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shia. And that's from the Rambam Sefer Afla, Hilchet Nedom 39, Shulchan Aruch Yodeh 234:30. Another question. Rav Elish said to Rava, in the case of one who says to his Canaanite slave, go and lend your services to another together with my lending cow to that person, what's halacha? Let the lemon be raised according to the one who says that the legal status of a person's agent is like that of himself, and then the lemon be raised according to one who says that the legal status of a person's agent is not like that of himself. Shalucha shel adam eina kamoso. The early commentators explain that the Gemara is not questioning whether the legal status of one's agent is like that of himself in general. It is clear from many other places in the Gemara that it certainly is. The question raised here is limited to the case of vows and borrowing, where the Torah appears to emphasize the need for the person himself to be involved. Throughout the passage pertaining to vows, the Torah states that her husband nullifies her vows. In the case of borrowing, the Torah talks about its owner being present. That's the Rambam Mitzvah and Sitos for. Let the dilemma be raised according to the one who says that the legal status of a person's agent is like that of himself, as follows. Does this matter apply only to an agent who is obligated in mitzvot, just like one who appointed him, but for a slave who is not obligated in mitzvot? Ever the la'u bar mitzvah, the only commentators question the relevance of one's obligation in mitzvot to his status as an agent. The Ravid explains, and it's similarly indicated by Rashi, that one can serve as an agent only with regard to an area of halacha that applies to him. Consequently, a Canaanite slave cannot be an agent for betrothal or divorce because he is not able to effect betrothal or divorce on his own behalf. In the case here as well, since a Canaanite slave cannot own property, the halacha of baileys do not apply to him, and he consequently should be unable to act as an agent to lend an item to someone else. By contrast, since a Canaanite slave is able to take their tithe produce grown in Eretz Yisrael, they're able to be an agent for that purpose. Many objections are raised against this interpretation by the early commentaries. The Ramban therefore offers his explanation. Since the verses detail the exemption of fruits to his owner, I was reading to assume that a Canaanite slave who cannot be an owner should be excluded. The principle does not apply. Or perhaps, even according to the one who says that the legal status of a person's agent is not like that of himself, maybe that matter applies to an agent who is a free, independent person, but in the case of a slave, he has no independence from his master, as the possession of a slave is like a possession of his master. i.e., anything that a slave acquires is automatically acquired by his master. Perhaps if the slave's services are borrowed, it is the same as if the master himself had been borrowed. Rava said to Rav Elish, it stands to reason that since the possession of a slave is like the possession of his master, then one who borrows both another's item and service of a slave is exempt from liability. Let's explain that. If one says to his agent, go and lend my cow together with your services to somebody on my behalf, then the exemption of borrowing an item together with its owner does not apply. This is in accordance with the ruling in the Shulchan Aruch. The Ramah, citing the Torah and several other early commentaries, maintain that the exemption applies even in this case. The Sheikh explains that the Ramah's ruling is based on the fact that there is uncertainty how to rule, and therefore the owner is unable to make a successful claim. According to the Sheikh rules that were the owner to seize the value of his item, the court would not repossess the item from him. If one says to his Canaanite slave, go and lend my cow together with your services to somebody on my behalf, then since the possession of a slave is like the possession of his master, the exemption does apply. The borrower is exempt from liability. The Bava Metzia Daf Hilchot Sheinu for Kadon 2.5 Shulchan Aruch Hilchot Mishpat Din 46.6. Rami Bahama raises a dilemma. What level of liability does a husband bear with regard to his wife's uniform property? The Mishnah Tract Yevamot states explicitly that a husband is not responsible for death or unavoidable accidents that occur to his wife's uniform property. It would appear then that he is not considered to be a borrower. If so, what is Rami Bahama's question? The Ravid suggests Rami Bahama was unsure whether the exemption mentioned in Tractate Yevamot is based on the fact that the husband is considered a renter, or whether he is considered a borrower, but the exemptions mentioned there are due to some additional factors. This is property belonging to the wife that the husband has the right to use and to enjoy its profits while they are married, but that is returned to her on termination of the marriage. That's the end of the Omid. Thank you very much for listening, and have a good day. All the best. Bye.